Hello, welcome to the 2020 Cundill Lecture. I'm Jeremy Tai, Assistant Professor of Modern Chinese History at McGill University. It's my pleasure to moderate today's talk and to greet you all tuning in from wherever you are in the world. This is the first event of the first ever Cundill History Prize Festival. Before we kick off this year's festivities, we'd like to acknowledge that McGill, the Cundill Prize's home institution, is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards on the lands and waters from which we welcome you all virtually today. The Cundill History Prize was founded in 2008 through an endowment by the late Peter Cundill, a McGill graduate, philanthropist, and history enthusiast. Each year's winner has been invited back the following year to deliver a lecture based on their winning book. Last year, Professor Julia Lovell of the University of London Birkbeck and her book, Maoism, A Global History, were recognized by our distinguished panel, a panel of distinguished jurists, and awarded the 2019 Cundill History Prize. She joins us today to deliver her talk entitled Writing Maoism as Global History. These events would not be possible without the work and support of many people in the Faculty of Arts at McGill and beyond. This year has been an extraordinary time, and we want to especially thank Mackenzie Bleho for her efforts in organizing the participants and coordinating the Cundill events as they moved on to a virtual platform. Special thanks also goes out to Daniel Cram at FMCM Associates and David Musgrove, Ben Hewitt, and Emily Thorne from History Extra. We'd also like to acknowledge the contributions made in the Department of History and Classical Studies, particularly with the work of my colleagues Gates Wallace and Jason Opal. Since we're all meeting virtually today, I'd like to orient everyone to the platform. If you have a question that you'd like to ask our speaker at the end of the talk, you just need to type it into the questions tab on the sidebar. It should be the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Questions can be asked at any point throughout the event. We may not have time to get through all of the questions submitted, but we will try our best. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Julia Lovell, Professor of Modern Chinese History and Literature at the University of London Birkbeck. Over the years, Professor Lovell has produced a rich body of scholarship. Her research has explored through the cultural realm Chinese nation building, China's relationship to foreign powers, and how history has been mobilized by various parties. Her publications have included The Great Wall, China Against the World, 1000 BC to 2000 AD, The Politics of Cultural Capital, China's Quest for a Nobel Prize in Literature, The Opium War, Drugs, Dreams, and the Making of China, which won the Jan Michalski Prize, and Splendidly Fantastic, Architecture and Power Games in China, and of course, Maoism, A Global History. In addition, Professor Lovell has been a prolific translator of some of China's most prominent writers. Her translations have included Han Xiaogong's A Dictionary of Ma Qiao, Zhang Ailing's or Eileen Chang's Less Caution, Yan Liangke's Service to the People, The Real Story of Baku and Other Stories of China, The Complete Fiction of Lu Xun, and Zhu Wen's The Matchmaker, The Apprentice and the Football Fan. In addition to the Jan Michalski Prize and the Cundill Prizes, she's also received the Philip Leverhulme Prize in 2010. She was shortlisted for the 2019 Baillie Guilford Prize, and she's a fellow of the British Academy. Without further ado, here is Julia Lovell.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you find yourself in the world right now. Thank you, Jeremy, for that introduction, and thank you to Dean Maione, McGill, and the Cundill Prize for welcoming me back in 2020, and to History Extra for playing host. We're in unusual circumstances for this year's Cundill History Festival, but it's a great pleasure to be returning to give this year's lecture. I have the very happiest memories of my days spent at Montreal last year, despite bringing deeply inappropriate footwear from London for a Canadian November. Naturally, I was thrilled, surprised, and hugely honoured to receive the prize. But beyond that, it was inspiring and invigorating to be part of the broader Cundill History Festival, to hear Maya Jasanov's brilliant lecture, and to participate with her and my fellow finalists in a roundtable on the uses and abuses of history today. I warmly echo Jeremy's thanks to all the individuals who have made this year's prize season possible, with a special mention to the infinitely helpful Daniel Cram of the Cundill team. And thanks to everyone in the audience today. I look forward to responding to your questions and to speaking with Jeremy in the second half. It's a particular privilege to have this opportunity now to talk about China in the world. The end of 2020 feels like an exceptionally timely moment at which to discuss this issue. This is a year that has undermined or outright destroyed so many of our assumptions about the way the world works. And historians are already viewing this year as a turning point for China's global role. Despite being the original epicenter of a global pandemic, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, has re-emerged with new confidence. It's broadcast a strong narrative about its success in handling the crisis, about its global generosity in distributing PPE to an ill-prepared world. It's pushed on foreign policy in claims to the South China Sea and a controversial new security law for Hong Kong, which breaks down the autonomy of the territory from China's political system. Western governments have responded with alarm. Fears of a new Cold War, now centred on China, not Russia, have seized imaginations this year, especially since China seems to have the upper hand in the key currency or weaponry of the contemporary world, tech and big data. In these febrile times, as we seem to be slipping back into a polarised Cold War world, it's more important than ever to understand the PRC's complex history of global interventions, from Mao to now, to grasp what kind of an international player it's likely to become. And the unpredictable transnational journeys of Maoism are at the centre of that story. What I want to do tonight is plant the PRC firmly within global history, but also kick against a rigid Cold War vision of a unitary Chinese communism pitted against the Western world. Instead, I want to evoke the elusive, surprisingly protean nature of Maoism and how I tried to find ways to write about it. I'm going to start in the first week of 2016, when strange events unfolded in central China. On the 6th of January, a 37-metre high golden statue of Mao was unveiled, rising up out of the frozen brown fields of Henan province. The statue, reports revealed, had been financed by local businessmen, costing around £312,000, about $420,000 US. It immediately became a draw for the area, with tourists gathering to take selfies in front of it. But within 48 hours, it all went wrong for the Golden Mao of Henan. The county government protested that the statue didn't have a registration permit, though I have no idea how they didn't notice the thing going up before then. And by the 8th of January, a monitoring team had demolished it. It was very puzzling. Even the usually authoritative People's Daily, the government's mouthpiece newspaper, was bemused, confessing that, quote, the reasons for the destruction were not clear, unquote. Now, I begin with the mysterious rise and fall of this Golden Mao colossus because it emblematizes the elusive quality of Mao and Maoism, both in and beyond China. Across the past 80 years, Mao and his ideas have had a vast but also unstable presence in Chinese and global politics, a phenomenon I wrote about in my most recent book and that I want to explore this evening. I'll first briefly examine some of the dissonances of this statue incident. The statue's fate stood first for Mao's curious status in China, where he's both a looming figure, but where also many of his complexities and enormities, including the huge human cost of his political experiments after he and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, took power in 1949, are effaced. The icon further showed how, paradoxically, Mao, the public enemy of religion and capitalism during his lifetime, has been co-opted into both these systems since his death. Look closely at this statue again in this slide, and you'll see that he doesn't look much like Mao at all, but his pose closely resembles that of ancestor portraits, the worship of which has, for centuries, millennia even, been the foundation stone of Chinese religious belief. And the statue was paid for by Hernanese entrepreneurs, even though Mao devoted himself between the 1950s and 1970s to destroying private business in China. In recent years, extraordinarily, Mao has become a hero for some of China's businessmen. Management lecturers invoke him as the model of the self-made man. And I'll have some more to say later about unpredictable Chinese reworkings of Mao. This vanishing Mao is also an emblem of his erratic status outside China, in the West. In contemporary Western commentary during the High Cold War, he is a towering figure, and often one of towering menace to the Western camp. During the 1960s and 1970s, European, American, and Australian policymakers accused China of a, quote, program for Maoist world domination, reminiscent of Mein Kampf, of leading a worldwide subversive movement in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. Mao's ideas have had long, diverse, global afterlives in revolutions, civil wars, and insurrections that have transformed states and societies. Maoism helped shape events as geographically and chronologically disparate as the Malayan emergencies, starting in 1948, the 1965 killings in Indonesia, the cultural revolutions of Western Europe and the US of 1968, the Khmer Rouge genocide, the end of white rule in southern Rhodesia and the rise of Robert Mugabe's ZANU, the civil war in Nepal between 1996 and 2006 that ended centuries of monarchy, and contemporary insurrection in India's jungles. And of course, it's left a heavy imprint on China today. Maoism has meant very different things in different places. In Vietnam, it helped build a party and army able to face down the French and then US empires. Excuse me. In Western Europe, it stood for Jochi rebellion and galvanized terrorism, as these juxtaposed pictures show. So here on the left is one of the most stupid international misrepresentations of Mao I've encountered. It comes from a 1967 special supplement, The Little Pink Book, in the French equivalent of Playboy, in which images of undressed young women, like this one jumping out of a huge white cake with a rifle, were accompanied humorously by famous Mao quotes. Revolution is not a dinner party in this case. To the right, we see the first kidnap victim from 1972 of the Mao-infused Italian terrorists, the Red Brigades. They claimed to be quoting Mao in the notice hung around his neck, which translates as hit and run. One of the big draws of Maoism to the Western European hard left was the way it validated the use of violence against political enemies. So side by side, these images run the gamut of how variously Maoism was interpreted in Western Europe alone. Playful tackiness on the one hand, political violence on the other. Moving on to Peru now, Maoism inspired a tiny band of under-equipped ideologues, the Shining Path, to challenge the government almost to the point of toppling the state between 1980 and 1992. So in this slide, Shining Path militants in the early 1990s are marching beneath the Maoist sentiment, nada es imposible, nothing is impossible, towards a highly idealized picture of their supreme leader, Abimael Guzman, who visited China twice in the 1960s, where he received political and explosives training. And yet, despite this very global influence, since Mao's death in 1976, many Western analysts have not seen Mao and Maoism globally. My first piece of evidence for this is the fact that, despite its faults and gaps, the book that I published last year is, as far as I know, the first global history of Maoism in a European language. One has only to compare the quantities of books about Hitler and Stalin and their international consequences with the paucity of studies that explore the legacies of Maoism throughout the world. It's true that the last 20 years have seen a rediscovery among China historians of global outreach under Mao, building on a temporary opening of the archives in the early 2000s. I'd like to mention just a few of the most important contributions which have transformed understanding, and certainly transformed my understanding. Books by Chen Jian, Arnie Westad, Jeremy Friedman, also by Shen Zhihua, Xia Yafeng, Sergei Rodchenko, and Zhang Yangwen. And we already had some great national studies, for example, of Maoism in France or India, pictured here. But there was no synthetic comparative history of communist China's impact on a wide range of conflict and unrest erupting since the Second World War in Asia, Africa, the Americas, Europe, and the Middle East. Why is this? Why have historians tended not to write Maoism as a global phenomenon? I'd suggest a few reasons. These reasons refer especially to and tell us about non-specialist perceptions of China and of its imprint on world history, but they've also had a bearing until quite recently on academic trends, which in another setting I'd be happy to say more about. The first reason concerns post-Mao directions in popular Anglophone books about China, above all the huge success since the 1980s of memoirs describing the chaotic xenophobia of the Cultural Revolution. There are many examples, but Wild Swans is the most famous. It sold more than 10 million copies worldwide and was incidentally the book that convinced the 20-year-old me that I had to learn Chinese. When I was discovering Chinese history in the mid to late 1990s, these books were important parts of reading lists, and for good reasons, for they presented compelling, accessible narratives of political violence and persecution. From consuming these, it was possible for non-specialist readers, and I fear people like me who devoured these accounts, it was possible to extrapolate out to assume that Mao's China as a whole was isolated from the rest of the world, that it had no meaningful foreign outreach. Yet, of course, as soon as you start to think properly about it, which I did about 10 years ago, outside the early years of the Cultural Revolution, in which the foreign policy of the PRC did indeed self-destruct, outside these early years of the Cultural Revolution, it's clear that Mao-era China poured hard work, money, and considerable skill into extending its influence throughout the world. The perception of Maoism as a system of ideas and practices relevant only to China has also kept it on the edges of global history. Many general histories of communism or the Cold War have underestimated the importance of Maoist China as offering a genuine alternative to the Soviets in providing intellectual and practical support to rebels throughout the world. In these books, Maoism is often categorized as a case study of the Russian Marxist-Leninist paradigm, rather than as a potential paradigm itself. I think that the spread and resilience of Mao's ideas have been obscured too by the end of the Cold War in Europe, especially since the communist collapse in Europe and the USSR. Non-specialists have imagined there was little need to engage seriously with Maoism because it, along with other communist ideologies, had apparently been sent to the dustbin of history along with the Soviet bloc states in 1989. At least one history department reading list on global history I've seen called its 1989 class The Fall of Communism, not in Vietnam or North Korea or China, which under Communist Party rule has since become a global superpower. A greater sense of cultural and political distance between, say, Western countries and China, greater than the sense of distance with Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia, has, moreover, led to some very odd cultural transformations, suggesting a sense of detachment about Mao in the West, among non-specialists at least. Already in 1972, 4 years before the chairman's death, Andy Warhol began the process of turning Mao into unthreatening kitsch. A few years ago, I walked into the office of an Indian MP in Delhi to discuss the Maoist insurgency in central and eastern India, to come face to face with a more than life-size, full-length pop art portrait of Mao striding along holding a Louis Vuitton bag. And even while a broad swathe of Western readers now equate Mao with Stalin or Hitler for the destructiveness of his policies, tourists to China snap up copies of The Little Red Book, or Mao emblazoned lighters playing the Maoist anthem, The East is Red. Visitors to contemporary Germany would not dream of buying copies of Mein Kampf. I inherited my Little Red Book, that's my excuse. China's own shaping of the historical narrative of its foreign policy has also helped fade awareness of Maoism's international impact. As the PRC has climbed to superpower status, its rulers have advanced the theory of China's peaceful rise. They insist that its new strength and influence will be a force for international harmony rather than militant nationalism. And history is an important corroborating part of this view. Government publicity holds that China has never interfered in the sovereign affairs of other countries. Official China, therefore, doesn't want to illuminate its desire for leadership of the global revolution during the Maoist period, a time when the PRC widely exported not only ideology, including more than 1 billion copies of Mao's Little Red Book in dozens of languages, but also harder currencies of revolution, money, weapons and training for global insurgencies, especially in the developing world. Because the history of global Maoism raises so many sensitive political issues for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party today, it's hard to research in China. Many key archival and oral sources remain out of reach. The CCP is good at keeping records, though not necessarily at declassifying them. So you have a global topic with a massive archive in China that is not globalized at all. These materials won't become available unless the CCP ceases to rule. A big clawback on research, in fact, linked to elite Chinese politics, started not long after I began my book in 2012. It became ever harder to do archival and oral history work on foreign policy in China. This clawback was so significant that a number of researchers had to rethink or abandon their projects on the Mao era. And from that perspective, I chose a terrible time to write about global Maoism. So in searching for sources, I had to cast my net far wider than China. I accessed, sometimes myself, sometimes with the help of superb research assistants without whom the work would have been impossible, materials in Chinese, English, Bengali, Nepali, Vietnamese, Mongolian, Shona, French, Spanish, Italian, German and Norwegian in archives and libraries across Asia, the Americas, Africa and Europe. I worked with Chinese Communist Party reports, diplomats and propagandists in Beijing and Shanghai. I also worked in a former cocoa warehouse turned archive in Amsterdam, with police records in Paris, with retired revolutionaries in Kolkata, with Maoist ministers in Kathmandu, with truth and reconciliation transcripts of Maoist civil war in Peru. There were minuses and pluses to this challenging research process. Gathering material was effortful, but as you might expect from such a diverse source base, its insights were very varied. And what began as a workaround, I just couldn't find enough sources in China, came to shape productively the ways in which I understood and wrote about the global journeys of Mao's ideas. The dispersed, various nature of my archive made it possible to write this history of an ideology as a history of social movements and experience, with all the variations, adaptations, misunderstandings, human agency and emotions that you'd expect from such a history. And that's just as well as I think of myself as a historian of culture rather than of ideology or political thought. For example, oral history interviews yielded rich and sometimes idiosyncratic insights into the social and cultural experience of Mao's ideas across the world. A Nepali Maoist minister told me how Mao's ideas had given her a language of rebellion that enabled her to resist arranged marriage and her parents' brutal opposition to female education. The son of an Ecuadorian guerrilla revealed that his father abandoned his political training in China because he couldn't locate a reliable source of whiskey. A veteran New York radical reminisced to me about reading the Little Red Book to his marijuana plant to help it grow. True story. And of course, chasing archives and testimonies all over the world was essential to seeing Maoism as a global history, one that ranges across 5 continents and a couple of dozen national case studies. I should add as a disclaimer here, though, that for reasons of space, I regretfully had to leave out of my book whole cohorts of global Maoists: the Caribbean, Mexican, Philippine, Swiss and Icelandic Maoists, or the members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization hosted in Mao's China on euphemistic scholarships to study modern Chinese literature. But writing global history is about far more than collaging far-flung case studies. It's about finding connections and tensions between diverse events, regions, individuals, and objects. I'm inspired by Isabel Hofmeier's claim for global transnational history, namely that, quote, historical processes are constructed in the movement between places, sites, and regions, unquote. In other words, I'm not just interested in the fact that Mao's ideas and practices travel, but also in what happens to them on their travels. Sometimes the reshaping or distortions that they undergo while being translated and mistranslated swing back to influence their development within China, their place of origin. Why Maoism was first created as a global phenomenon before it even existed as a coherent set of ideas in China, thanks to the CCP's careful cultivation of a sympathetic American journalist called Edgar Snow, whom they hoped would give them good international publicity. The CCP invited Snow to visit their breakaway state in northwest China in 1936, when the CCP was the underdog in a long civil war. During his stay, Edgar Snow was given red carpet treatment and extensive access to Mao. Snow was charmed and wrote up a very favourable portrait both of Mao and of the communist movement in a 1937 global bestseller called Red Star Over China. This book turned Mao into an international political personality 5 years before he actually became paramount leader of the CCP, and 6 years before the CCP even coined the phrase Mao Zedong thought, or Maoism. The Chinese translation, also published in 1937 by an underground communist agent called Hu Yuzhi, had a huge impact in China as well. The book's rosy depiction of a community of idealistic, patriotic communists persuaded swathes of educated, energetic young people to join the CCP. Mao, too, fell in love with the book's idealized vision of a self-reliant, militarized communist utopia. So much so that he tried to impose it uniformly across China after 1949, with tragic results. Chinese communism started out in the 1920s as a polycentric phenomenon that was pragmatically adapted to suit each region of China in which it took root. After 1949, under Mao, though, it became dangerously dogmatic. It was this loss of flexibility, the one-size-fits-all approach, that led to many of the cataclysms of the Mao era from the 1950s onwards. The Great Leap Forward and its subsequent famine, and Mao's attempt to resurrect this model in the Cultural Revolution. So Maoism's international outreach also defined Mao and his domestic politics. I want to underline then, this thing that I, for convenience's sake, am calling Maoism is a living, changing collection of ideas and practices with very various meanings across time and space. There are a few constants in this bundle of ideas. For example, Mao's defiance of colonialism or imperialism, his validation of violence to achieve revolution. Remember his saying, power comes out of the barrel of a gun. There's also his emphasis on mobilizing and organizing rural society, and his love of something called voluntarism, the idea that as long as they believed they could, the Chinese and any other people could transform the world. But the body of ideas and practices labeled Maoism contains major contradictions too. Here's one. Like Lenin, like Stalin, Mao was determined to build a militarized one-party state that worshipped its supreme leader, i.e. himself. But he also always saw himself as an outsider, and especially in his last decade, championed an anarchic insubordination. He told the Chinese people and the world that it's right to rebel. This contradiction between autocracy and rebelliousness came together during the Cultural Revolution in 1966, when he deployed his own cult to mobilize millions of Chinese people to smash party rivals whom he deemed counter-revolutionary. Cold warriors in the West have often used the term Maoism as a catch-all word for totalitarian politics. But Maoism is a volatile political creed that simultaneously reveres a centralized party, collective obedience, and anti-state rebellion. And it's a creed that's been multiply reinterpreted over the past 80 years. At a time when Western governments and media often demonize China as a monolithic totalitarian enemy, it's as important as ever to acknowledge and explore the complexities of Chinese politics and culture. So it makes excellent intellectual sense to tell this unstable, malleable phenomenon of Maoism as social, cultural, and global history, as well as politics and ideology, because social, cultural, and global history has to be so attentive to reworkings by different groups and individuals. I wanted to show the diversity as well as commonality of ways in which Mao's ideas were experienced and remade across the world. As a practicing translator myself, I was particularly struck by the wayward mistranslations that Mao's ideas and practices often underwent as they crossed the world. One of my favourite minor examples was the mangling in 1960s Tanzania, where there was much admiration for Mao's China of one of Mao's most famous anti-colonial sound bites, "Imperialism is a paper tiger." The full version is "Imperialism and all reactionaries are paper tigers," but it's often shortened. Due to the lack of tigers in East Africa, and hence the lack of a word for tiger in Swahili, Mao's slogan was instead rendered, "Imperialism is a paper leopard." Many of global Maoism's actual consequences turned out to be unintended due to the agency and mistranslations of individuals and circumstances. The story of global Maoism exemplifies the unpredictable course of communist China's quest for international influence, still a major project for the CCP today. However closely China's party state has tried to mould and direct its global image in order to increase soft and hard power, its initiatives have often spun off in unexpected, uncontrollable directions. The history of global Maoism is rich with pushback against Maoist influence. The PRC under Mao poured $20 billion in aid to Vietnam between 1950 and 1975. But Vietnamese resentment of PRC interventions soured into a terrible border war in 1979. The PRC also showered Africa with resources, aids, loans, scholarships, railways. When Chinese military advisors arrived in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, ready to propagate Mao's revolution though, they encountered politicians and students eager to take advantage of Chinese generosity without committing to the Chinese political model. One Chinese soldier grumbled into his memoir that his Zambian students were always turning up at irregular times of day to catch fizzy drinks off him, and they even nabbed a neat little stool that he'd made for himself. So he had to teach Mao's ideas to them standing up. So in Africa, large investments brought little or no political traction for Mao-era China. No decolonized African country actually adopted the Chinese communist state framework after taking power. In sum then, it's not helpful to lift a term of reference from Star Trek. It's not helpful to think of Maoism and its globalization as a kind of Borg, exported irresistibly and identically all over the world. Instead, we're looking at a highly interactive set of travels, a collection of regional and local adaptations which have sometimes changed the applications of Mao's ideas at home in China. But neither is this a devolved, centerless process. we can't shut the state out of the history of global Maoisms either. For the journeys of Maoism were financed and underpinned by the efforts of a powerful, ambitious nation state, that of communist China, and were often shaped by the responses of other strong governments, armies, and security forces. Now, I want to develop this idea of adaptations and mistranslations in two examples of global Maoism, Maoist movements in India and Nepal between the late 1960s and the present day. I focus on them here for three reasons. First, they're the Maoist insurgencies outside China that have had the greatest political consequences for the states in which they operated. The Indian one has been ongoing since 1967. In 2006, the Indian state labelled it the country's biggest internal security challenge. And in this slide here, you see a Maoist party congress in northeastern India from close to that time. The decade-long civil war began by the Nepali Maoists in 1996 was the decisive factor in bringing to an end centuries of Hindu monarchy and founding a federal republic after 2006. And on the right of this slide, we have Prachanda, leader of the Nepali Maoists during the civil war, being appointed prime minister for the second time in 2016. Second, these two examples unsettle Eurocentric definitions of communist revolution, which hold up the Russian case as paradigm. After the sudden collapse of Soviet bloc communisms between 1989 and 1991, Francis Fukuyama famously declared that humans had reached the end of history with capitalism's definitive victory over communism. But once you write Maoism back into the global history of the 20th century, you start to get a very different narrative from the standard one in which communism loses the Cold War in 1989 in Europe and vanishes as a political force. The Maoist insurgency in India and Nepal took place through and beyond the supposed end of the Cold War, from the 1980s up to the present day. And of course, Maoism continues to leave its mark on China, which I'll come back to at the end. Third, these two examples contain some of the most striking global adaptations and mistranslations of the Maoist creed. Now let's consider first the way in which China led and shaped these insurgencies. Both resulted from an intense international propaganda campaign of the 1960s, in which Mao's China advertised itself as the headquarters of global insurgency, both anti-Western and anti-Soviet. Beijing and training camps in South and East China became hubs for a diverse bunch of international rebels. There were Chilean bolero singers, jiving Zanzibaris, even a Briton called Elsie Fairfax Cholmondeley, who to me sounds more like a character from a P.G. Wodehouse novel than a Maoist. Radicals in India and Nepal, and many other places, including the future Shining Path leadership in Peru, eagerly absorbed political tracts and broadcasts out of China, calling to annihilate class enemies and the servants of imperialism. A few revolutionaries from these states visited China for political and military training. A veteran Indian Maoist decades later described how Mao in 1967 gifted him a cigar and promised him 90,000 square kilometers of disputed border territory once the revolution had triumphed in India. India and Nepal both witnessed brief Maoist wars in the late 60s to early 70s, two of the regional explosions of the Cultural Revolution. The Indian version, the Naxalite rebellion starting in the northeast, was loudly clapped at the time by China's leadership, which acclaimed it the front paw of the revolution. And here's an image of the site in the village of Naxalbari today, where a triggering act of police violence took place. It's marked with busts of Mao and others in the Sino-Indian Maoist pantheon. There's also a bonus cricket game going on in the background. Apologies for that. Now, as well as evidencing the immediate impact of Mao's global revolutionary project, India and Nepal also showcased the ability of Mao's ideas to incubate in particular socio-economic circumstances. In both these countries, after short-lived insurgencies, Maoist activists went to ground for at least 20 years, organising and proselytising before re-erupting into open people's war with their respective states in the 1990s and 2000s. The Indian Maoists created base areas and a guerrilla army in the jungles of central eastern India. The Nepali Maoist insurgency only re-emerged out into the open in 1996, when it declared war on the Nepali state. This long, slow evolution is arguably a Maoist revolution paradigm. The French and Russian examples, at least in popular imagination, emphasize revolution as a sudden eruption of huge popular energy in political centers. The Chinese Maoist model, by contrast, rests on 2 decades of trial and error mobilization in rural backwaters during the 1930s and 1940s. And that's a model you see borrowed in South Asia. In both Indian and Nepali cases, this was a revolution spread by the book, by printed words emanating from China. Maoist texts were vastly more important than direct experience of that revolution. The leaderships of the Indian and Nepali insurgencies all engaged intensely with Maoist theory through translations into English, Hindi, and Nepali. None of them, interestingly, came from the poorest peasant classes that Mao fetishized. Instead, they were educated intellectuals, a class that Mao himself was intensely suspicious of. One of the Indian leaders was the brother of a Mumbai ice cream magnate who first trained as an accountant before declaring Maoist war on the Indian state. As far as I know, no ranking Indian or Nepali Maoist leader had knowledge of Chinese or of Mao-era China independent of official propaganda in translation. Comrade Kiran, one of the leaders of the Nepali Maoist civil war, remains today doctrinally faithful to the political theory he imbibed through Mao's writing. And you can see here that he also devoutly keeps a large golden statue of Mao in his office, plus a vase inscribed with Mao's calligraphy. Both back in the 1960s and today, the Indian Maoist Party remains overtly theoretically Maoist. Its manifestos and constitutions are larded with terms from Mao's essays on 1930s China. Take a look here at the start of the party's constitution. I've highlighted in white references to Mao or his catchphrases, such as the new democratic revolution, the semi-colonial, semi-feudal system, and so on. Both Indian and Nepali insurgencies across the past half-century have drawn heavily on Mao's writings about military strategy, a combination of mass mobilization, willingness to use political violence against enemies, and dare to believe, dare to die voluntarism. In so doing, both insurgencies succeeded in challenging much better armed and financed states and their armies. The size and firepower of the Indian state have finally contained the Indian Maoists, but in Nepal in the 1990s, just as happened with the Maoist Shining Path in Peru in the 1980s, a disorganized state proved very vulnerable to under-equipped, determined, and indoctrinated Maoist guerrillas. So to those who say communist ideology is dead, I say, look at the Maoists of South Asia. Here, though, I don't want to tell a Cold Warrior story of Beijing-directed subversion. For both these Maoist civil wars developed conspicuous and surprising differences with the original model. Moreover, in their battles with their respective states since the 1980s, neither benefited from Chinese sponsorship, quite the opposite, in fact. By 1978, Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, had begun to mothball the keynote policies of the Cultural Revolution, communes and mass spectacle purges, and he'd imprisoned Mao's closest allies, including his wife. And here's an image of Deng enjoying a Texan rodeo in 1979. China now focused on domestic economic reconstruction and on attracting foreign investment. China's militant and expensive ambitions to lead the world revolution during the Mao era became a source of acute embarrassment. Deng quickly banned domestic and international sales of the Little Red Book and ordered almost all extant volumes to be pulped. Far from sponsoring global Maoists, the PRC now publicly condemned them. China's party state backed the nemesis of the Nepali Maoists, the Nepali monarchy, until almost the end of the civil war. When communications finally opened up after the Nepali Maoists formed a government in 2008, one of the CCP's earliest privately delivered pieces of advice to them was to abandon the name Maoist because it found the term embarrassing. Rather, I'd like to underline here the remarkable ability of ideas and practices labelled as Maoist to take root in and adapt to particular locales at highly unpropitious geopolitical moments, namely as the Soviet bloc collapsed and China abandoned Maoist pugnacity to pursue capitalist growth. Both Indian and Nepali Maoisms gained traction through the 1980s and beyond by attacking socio-economic enormities particular to their countries: discrimination against untouchables and ethnic minorities. Even critics of the Nepali Maoists today acknowledge the Maoists' contribution in giving voice to groups marginalised by high caste elites, though not all these promises were realised after the end of the civil war in 2006. But this is a striking departure from the application of Mao's policies in China, which were violently intolerant of the rights of ethnic minorities, especially in Tibet and Xinjiang. Contemporary Indian Maoism has also allied itself with environmental protest over industrial development of central and eastern India. But in China, Mao has been credited, if that's the right word, with waging war on nature through his plans for crash industrialization. Most remarkably, perhaps, the Nepali Maoists, guided by their ideologue Baburam Bhattarai, who we see on the left here, combined Maoism, an ideology not famous for its willingness to countenance competitors. They combined Maoism with parliamentary democracy. In the early 2000s, Bhattarai successfully argued for using the political pressure achieved by Maoist civil war to unite with other parliamentary parties against the Nepali monarchy and introduce republican democracy. And that is the system that came into existence after the end of the civil war in 2006. But I started, and I want to finish back in China. I want to test my idea of malleable Maoism in the country where it remains so intertwined with a powerful nation state, now intolerant of political diversity. 30 years since communism disintegrated in Europe and then in the USSR, China's Communist Party and one-party rule continue seemingly to flourish, still beneath the gaze of Mao Zedong, pictured here on the northern edge of Tiananmen Square, the centre of Chinese political power. Contemporary China is, of course, different, almost beyond recognition from Mao's. It's tied into global finance, its political equilibrium and legitimacy are bound to economic performance rather than ideological purity. China's media are now too diversified for a single old-style ideological message to convince its citizens. Even so, after 2012, the CCP embarked upon an official national revival of Maoist culture and politics. The leaders of the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping have, for the first time since Mao's death in 1976, again brought key elements of Maoist politics back into the mainstream. They've revivified practices such as self-criticism sessions, one of Mao's key tools for establishing thought control in the early 1940s. And they brought back, above all, a cult of personality, now centered around not Mao, but Xi. Xi Jinping is on record as saying that flying the flag of Maoism is essential to the CCP's survival. And here's a tasteful visualization by the Chinese bling industry of the proximity of Xi Jinping to Mao Zedong. But, and this returns me to my argument about a multivalent Maoism, Mao and his ideas have an unstable legacy in contemporary China. The leaders of the CCP have turned Mao into an august father of the nation in order to shore up their historical legitimacy. To Xi Jinping, a Mao revival means intensifying party control, celebrating Mao's philosophy of ruthless struggle against problems and adversaries, and centralizing personal power. Yet there are major aspects of the Mao era that Xi Jinping is also determined to suppress. Above all, the bottom-up mobilizations by Mao during the Cultural Revolution that almost destroyed the party state in the late 1960s, and indeed Xi Jinping's own family. Archival shutdowns and tough censorship mean that open debate about the Mao era is impossible in China today. So Xi Jinping's restoration of the Maoist political repertoire is very partial and sits awkwardly within a China that is so transformed from the Mao era. And needless to say, the government hasn't been able to control all invocations of Mao. China today possesses a noisy, disputatious landscape of neo-Maoists who showcase individually some of the most perplexingly contradictory worldviews I've ever encountered. Take the example of Han Dechang, pictured here. In the 2000s, Han was one of China's most militant online Maoists with a big online presence. He was famous or infamous, partly for punching an old man who he'd heard bad-mouthing Mao during a street demonstration, a fracas shown on the right here. In 2013, Han stepped back from political activism to found an organic, self-sufficient commune based on what he described as a fusion of Maoism and Buddhism. When I met him at the farm in 2014, pictured on the left here, he alternated between pondering how to make ecological toothpaste out of a glut of squashes and reminiscing proudly about the righteousness of his fistfight with the old gentleman. Well, then again, consider Zhang Chengzhi, pictured here. He's a devout Muslim and Pan-Islamist, a best-selling author of romantic narratives of pastoral North China, an unrepentant former Red Guard, and a passionate admirer of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Zhang's mix of convictions is particularly surprising in the context of the CCP's current draconian crackdown on Muslim populations in northwest China, a continuation of religious intolerance under Mao. And while the CCP currently portrays Mao as national patriarch, many of contemporary China's neo-Maoists have turned him into a symbol of anti-government dissent. After the CCP dismantled urban welfare and job security in the 1990s, laid-off workers marched in protest, brandishing portraits of Mao, whom they acclaimed as the patron saint of workers' rights. Neo-Maoists in China, angry at the inequalities generated by the market and globalization, quote Mao's Cultural Revolution incitement to revolt against the state. It's right to rebel, 造反有理. The CCP has done its best to co-opt or silence such tendencies. Until Xi Jinping's partial Maoist comeback in 2012, China's neo-Maoists were subject to rigorous state censure. A recent eruption to trouble the government has been student Marxist societies, founded in China's top universities, pictured here. They've used their own readings of Mao to criticise present-day inequality for which government policies are largely responsible. In 2018, members of these societies helped organise worker protests against corporate exploitation. Plainclothes police quickly arrested and disappeared these protesters. At the same time, in a very uncomfortable echo of Mao's last campaign, the Cultural Revolution, university authorities are encouraging students to report teachers who air liberal, westernized ideas in class. So there are many Maos, many Maoisms in China today. Nowhere, I think, is the capricious character of the Chinese and global Maoist heritage more clearly expressed than in the ongoing crisis in Hong Kong. A former British colony, it's the most internationalised part of China, where diverse ideas about political and social organisation and the legacies of old and new empires, British and Chinese, contend. And the island's current struggles against mainland control, in addition to many other things, have become a battleground for defining Maoism. In 1967, at the peak of the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards in British colonial Hong Kong put Mao's calls to smash capitalism and imperialism into action through strikes, protests, riots, and bomb attacks against British rule. In other words, they brought revolution to the colony. And note in the left-hand image here, protesters are confronting colonial police with the Mao Bible, the Little Red Book. But fast forward to the anti-CCP protests of 2019, and Beijing's position had reversed. China's government still declares Mao Zedong thought its cardinal principle, but has discarded Mao's utopian turmoil in favour of authoritarian capitalism. It now stands willing to use a combination of political and military force to quell unrest on the island of Hong Kong. You see the protesters' sign on the left calling for revolution, anathema to Beijing today. Now, many Hong Kongers view China as an imperial power, and as I'll show below, they're eager to use Mao's rebellious anti-colonial rhetoric in their fights with Beijing. Tensions over defining Mao between Mao as revolutionary and Mao as party and state builder came together on the 1st of October last year, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. In Beijing that day, Xi Jinping, in a Mao suit, stood at the gate of Tiananmen Square, where Mao had stood 70 years earlier and celebrated Mao as founder of the nation. But that day, Mao was also on the minds of anti-CCP rebels in Hong Kong. Furious at being accused of terror tactics by the Hong Kong government, they justified their protests by citing some of Mao's most famously militant dicta on street placards. And you can see some of them in this image. Revolution is not a dinner party, and all reactionaries are paper tigers. And you might want to note the really unsettling merging of Xi Jinping's features into a Mao portrait in the top right of the image. And as the author of this tweet points out, it's rather inconvenient for the stability-obsessed Beijing government that their founder Mao was a career revolutionary who devoted at least 2/3 of his adult life to overthrowing the prevailing political order. This brings me to my concluding question. Given the diversity of interpretation and application that I've begun to sketch here, can we even speak usefully of such a thing as Maoism in and beyond China? I'd answer yes, but only if we understand the history of Maoism not as an unchanging entity within a rigidly polarized Cold War, but rather as being rich with geographical and chronological diversity. We need to see it as far more than ideological or intellectual or political history. We need to see it also as social, cultural, and above all, global history. Thanks very much for listening. I'll stop there and hand back to Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your talk. It's really inspiring to see how you overcome the limitations of the archive to cover this global story, and how you traverse these different revolutionary settings and the many Maos that have been produced out of these travels of Maoism. So just a reminder to our audience to enter questions in the control panel to the right hand side of the screen. So I guess I'll just kick off discussion by asking if you can just discuss further the relationship between internationalism in the past and China's place in the world today. And as you mentioned, in the case of Hong Kong, how China can be considered a colonial power. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this relationship between internationalism and Chinese expansionism, whether we're looking from a longue durée perspective, such as the literature that's come out on Qing Empire, or present-day examples in which we see Chinese influence expanding into different areas of the world, including Africa, as we discussed in your book.
Thank you for that very interesting and important question. I think my answer partly comes down to how we define the political entity of China today. Do we see it as a nation state, or do we see it as an empire? And there is a difficulty that a sort of intrinsic structural challenge that the contemporary People's Republic of China faces. The territory that the People's Republic of China lays claim to is the empire that was created during the 18th century by the last dynasty, the Qing. So through roughly 100 years of expansion and conquest, the territorial extent of China more or less doubled, with huge bolt-ons, particularly in the northwest and the northeast. So China at this point became a very multi-ethnic empire, and it took on a territorial extent that it had not taken on in the past. In 1911 to 1912, that last dynasty fall, but the various regimes that want to lay claim to the title of China after 1912, although a lot of their legitimacy rests on the idea that they represent a Han nationalism, the territory of China that they want to lay claim to is this sort of very expanded multi-ethnic territory that came into being largely in the 18th century, that includes many different ethnicities, Tibetans, Muslim Uyghurs in the northwest, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of the tensions and contradictions that you see within the Chinese polity today comes from that bad fit, if you like, that tension between the idea of China as a nation state versus sort of China as a multi-ethnic empire, which is the geographical territory that underpins China today.
Thank you. So is there any way that you would, I guess, qualify the differences between, like, let's say, what we're seeing in the 1960s and 1970s and today? Just to follow up on my question.
Of course, there are huge differences. If we take maybe one of the most salient features of contemporary PRC foreign policy, the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't see that as a way of China trying to export its ideology. I see it primarily as a way for China to resolve some of its own sort of domestic economic supply issues, and also as a way to build up areas on its borders to create markets for Chinese products. So it's very different from the more sort of purist ideological campaigns that you see in the 1960s and 1970s. But even having said that, in the Mao era, although the rhetoric was all about China being for the world revolution, wanting to help oppressed peoples of the world be victorious against sort of imperialists and their servants and so on, there was a certain amount of national amour propre involved in that Maoist Chinese position. You know, the idea that the center of the world revolution had definitely shifted to China, and that China had the right to be a model to other parts of the world. And I think maybe that is something you're seeing echoed a little bit in the present day, something I've noticed myself in following statements about party and political ideology in China, is that it's sort of roughly from 2018 you started to see party theorists speak with a new self-confidence about the Chinese Communist Party model, the CCP model, as a model with potential application for other parts in the world. Of course, Xi Jinping has very much gone on the record as saying that, Mao Zedong thought is still a cardinal principle of the People's Republic of China. It's essential to fly the flag of Maoism and so on. So I think we can see an overlap there. I think also that the contemporary government of the PRC, they're happy to sort of choose when they might use that memory of the 1960s and where they might not. So, for example, in Cambodia, that memory is absolutely buried, not least because of the absolute sort of tragic results of the Maoist influence on the Khmer Rouge. It is an established fact that the People's Republic of China were the main aid givers and backers of the Khmer Rouge during their disastrous time in power between 1975 and 1979, but that's not really acknowledged in China officially at all. But in Africa, by contrast, where China today, has a huge outreach policy for sort of industry and investment. There are many natural resources in Africa, which the PRC is interested in getting a share of. There, for example, in Zimbabwe, you will see China's leaders, sort of quite happy to bring back memories of how the ZANU freedom fighters were hosted in Beijing in the 60s and 70s, and the help that Beijing gave that political movement in order to kind of foster a sense of sort of goodwill and a kind of a shared long relationship. So I think the PRC is willing to be quite pragmatic about it. Again, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to these things.
Thank you so much. So we have a few audience questions that come in. Meredith McDonough wants to know, hi, lovely talk and book. Thank you so much. Related to the point you just made about nation state and empire, I'm curious about your thoughts in response to the tension between embracing the powerful legacy of being an ancient civilization, here thinking of the 2008 Olympic ceremony, for example, and the revolutionary hostility to the old ways. Is there a contradiction? Could this be resolved by conceptually distinguishing between an ancient civilization but a revolutionary nation state?
What an interesting and important question. Thank you very much, Meredith. Yeah, I'm really fascinated by Chinese archaeology because so much time and energy and money is poured into archaeology within China today. I think showcasing how important it is to the contemporary Chinese government to have archaeological scientific evidence of a sort of long, glorious continuity of Chinese culture stretching back thousands of years. But you're absolutely right, between the Mao era, 1949, through to the mid-1970s, for most of that time, anything old, pre-1949, anything labelled traditional, was extremely vulnerable to attack, or interpretations of these things from the past were subject to sort of very stringent political controls. That's changed somewhat since Mao's death. Particularly in the 1990s, the CCP began to attach its legitimacy sort of not just to Marxism, but I think above all to nationalism, and to show themselves as the sort of great defenders of China's millennia-old culture. And the 2008 the opening ceremony for the Olympics was a really fascinating example of kind of all the tensions, the cultural and political tensions within China today, about balancing the glories of the ancient past with shiny modernity, but also the Mao period in the middle. And what was really striking about that ceremony was that the way you had apparently the entire stretch of Chinese civilization, from the drum dancers chanting Confucius at the beginning, through to sort of ultra modern tightrope dancers sort of dressed in lime green spandex at the end, and yet this sort of huge sweep over Chinese history left the Mao period completely unmentioned. It was as if it just didn't happen at all. So that I think really spoke of a very expressive discomfort about what to do with the Maoist period at that point in history. And to my mind, the big sea change since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 has been this partial national revival of the Maoist political repertoire. It's well known that Xi Jinping himself is the son of one of Mao's own revolutionary comrades. So Xi Jinping owns his own kind of political bloodline of power, if you like, to the revolutionary heritage. And I think the way that I analyse it is that leaders in 2012, well, first of all, they inherited a very dangerous situation in which the Chinese Communist Party was sort of mired in a sort of really threatening level of corruption, and therefore being discredited as obviously as a communist party, as a party interested ultimately in sort of equalizing society. But I think also that the leaders by that point had perhaps made a calculation that enough time had passed between the enormities and the cataclysms of the Mao era and the present day for them to use certain sort of symbols or parts of the culture of the Mao era to sort of generate a sense of sort of warm, fuzzy political legitimacy. One example of that is, one of Xi Jinping's keynote policies after coming to power in 2012 was a really huge sweeping anti-corruption campaign, which took aim at some very, very high-ranking officials and sort of middle and low-ranking officials as well. Very, very serious consequences for individuals. And a documentary was made to publicise the objectives of the anti-corruption campaign, and sort of very prominently, this documentary made use of footage from the very early era of Mao's control over the party, so back in the Northwest in the late 1930s and 1940s, to evoke a time when the Chinese Communist Party, wasn't about corruption and getting rich and sort of creaming off sort of huge construction budgets. It sort of alluded back to a time when the communists were sort of pure and simple and uncorrupt. So it's definitely been a very bumpy ride since the death of Mao with regards to what to do about the Maoist heritage, what to do about this sort of extraordinary long cultural past of China. It's a story which is still developing, but it's absolutely worth following because it tells you so much about the self-perception and aims of China's leaders.
Thank you so much. So we have quite a lot of questions coming in now. Li Chen, this is our colleague from Toronto. Thanks for the interesting talk, and I very much appreciate you sharing your journey of completing this research project and your analysis of the complexity and diversity of the historical evolution of Maoism. I'm curious to know your view of Alexander Cook's Mao's Little Red Book, A Global History, which was published in 2014. What might be the reasons why Cook's Global History of Mao's Little Red Book should not be considered a global history of Maoism?
I have a great admiration for that book. It is an edited collection of essays by individual scholars with particular specialisms in different parts of the world, some working on China, some France, Peru, India, Italy, and Yugoslavia. And I love its focus on sort of material culture. This object, this the object of the Little Red Book, and how this object traveled, and the particular values attached to this object. I suppose I wouldn't, so huge admiration for the book. I think the book achieves, everything you would hope a global history of the Little Red Book would achieve. I suppose two ways in which my work is different, that, the Little Red Book and other sort of transnational objects are very important to me, but I'm going beyond a single object to sort of focus on different individuals, to different particular ideas, particular essays, and so on. And my book was, as being completed by a single author, was sort of trying to take a sort of helicopter view within a single narrative voice of this sprawling, ultimately polycentric phenomenon of global Maoism from the 1930s through to the present day.
Thank you. So we also have a couple of questions on non-Han regions. Surab Dewan from India would like to know, hi Julia, how would you place Mao's thought with respect to one nationality in the context of the current Tibetan crisis? And then we have another question by Robert Eagleton. Are Western reports on the situation of Xinjiang accurate, or is there a degree of misrepresentation due to Cold War motivations?
Thank you very much for those really important questions, and I think it's very important for people who write and speak about China to directly address the question of Xinjiang, as the plight of the Uyghurs is something that we should all take very seriously indeed. Yes, I do take seriously the reporting that has been done. There have been some very moving accounts of the way, particularly that I mean, not just cultural figures, but I think cultural figures within Xinjiang Uyghur culture have been particularly targeted by this campaign to sort of undermine the specificity of Uyghur culture and language. I think that's why some analysts have used the term cultural genocide which is obviously a hugely emotive term, but it's why particular analysts have used that term to describe what is going on. With regards to Tibet, this is a related question. In communism in general, through its history, has not been easily tolerant of other belief systems, and so Tibet has very often been a target of the People's Republic of China's unease about other religious loyalties, which is why I was so struck by, for example, the stance of one of the figures that I mentioned towards the end, the Muslim Chinese writer Zhang Chengzhi, who, despite being a devout Muslim and Pan-Islamist, could combine this position with a sort of devotion to many of Mao's ideas, especially the Cultural Revolution. And this was very striking to me, particularly as the sort of high point of religious intolerance during the Mao era came during the Cultural Revolution. The question of Tibet was something also that I encountered often when I was doing my work on Maoism in Nepal. It was very striking to me that the leaders of the Nepali Maoist movement, who adapted the Maoist creed to, in some cases, champion the plight of oppressed ethnic minorities within Nepal. It was striking to me how they could make this journey, given that the sort of results of the outcome, if you like, of Mao era China's and China's intolerance towards religion and different ethnicities was kind of underneath their noses, really, with the Tibetan refugee camps within Nepal.
Thank you so much. Question from one of my former students, Lanya Feng. Thank you, Professor Lovell, for the talk. One of the most famous quotes from Mao is, "Women take up half the sky," or "Women hold up half the sky." And some Chinese activists have expressed nostalgia, perhaps a romanticized version at times, about socialist gender equality. I'm curious whether you encounter any feminist activists outside of China, such as in Southeast Asia and Africa, using Maoism as a tool for resistance or lingering reminiscence of the socialist Maoist period of female liberation.
Yeah, it's a really important aspect of Mao's thought, which I didn't have time to talk about in the lecture, but it is absolutely a really important part of his global appeal. One thing that your question highlights, and I kind of alluded to indirectly within the talk, was Mao's talent for sound bites, which was arguably greater than, say, Marx's or Lenin's or Stalin's. And it was this kind of stylistic flair for these sort of punchy sound bites, which also helped vector his ideas across the world, that these ideas could be expressed in these very sort of pithy aphorisms. And one of these is absolutely what he said about women, that women can hold up half the sky. It's worth pointing out that Mao's kind of rhetorical stance on feminism contrasted very starkly with his own behavior towards the women in his own life. You know, he sort of abandoned and sort of serially impregnated women who sort of became his wives, and then he would distance himself from them when he got tired of them, and you know, particularly after he came to power and as he was sort of aging between the 50s and 70s, he really sort of grotesquely abused his own sort of political status to sort of take advantage of various adoring young women who were placed around him. I have certainly encountered responses to Mao's sort of feminist rhetoric in South Asia, not so much in Southeast Asia or Africa, but I suppose I would draw you here to the kind of Western European and American love affair with Maoism in the late 60s and early 1970s, where, you know, not just women can hold up the sky, but other aspects of what was seen as part of the Cultural Revolution political repertoire were very attractive to second wave feminism. So, you know, particularly the idea which sort of came over to the West in sort of eyewitness accounts by Westerners, the idea of the so-called struggle session or the speak bitterness session, in which women as well as men could stand up and denounce the different people and forces that had been oppressing them. So they could sort of denounce their husbands and their fathers and so on. This had a definite influence on second wave feminism in Europe and the United States. And this is again sort of one of those puzzles of Maoism in its global form, particularly in the West. You know, there were lots of idiocies and stupidities about the way that the Cultural Revolution and Maoism were sort of misunderstood and misidentified as a youthful rebellion in the 1960s and 1970s. Having said that, I think we can also say that kind of Maoist moment of the counterculture movement of the late 1960s, along with many other forces, it kind of fed into a sort of broader liberalizing current that changed public life, changed education, that has sort of in some ways helped us end up with the academy that we have today. So, you know, obviously a subject which is right at the front of our minds at the moment is the idea of Black Lives Matter and decolonizing the curriculum. If you sort of go back in time to the late 1960s and 1970s, say in the United States, it was activists who were within Maoist parties, very well versed in the ideas of Maoist politics, who stayed within academia rather than going into full-time activism in the early 1970s, who were, you know, major parts of the campaign to bring ethnic studies and Black studies into the curriculum in American universities, which then also had an impact on universities in other parts of the West. So I'm not saying that Maoism is the only influence on this kind of broadly liberalizing direction, but it is one influence among many.
So interesting, thank you. Question from Sophie Tupan. Can you speak about the place of science and technology in Maoism in thoughts and practices globally over time?
Well, Mao was very keen on science and technology. That during the Cultural Revolution, a time when most universities and schools were shut down for several years, Mao made very sure that sensitive scientific programs were allowed to carry on, particularly scientific programs with military or defense application. So this is the time when, a few years ago, I'm sure we remember, that a Chinese medical researcher, Tu Youyou, was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine. And that was broadly for work that she was doing during the Cultural Revolution, when so many Vietnamese and Chinese soldiers were dying in Vietnam in the war against America due to malaria in the jungles. And the Chinese state under Mao, despite the chaos which was reigning in many parts of China, with the Cultural Revolution having undermined the sort of existing institutional authority, with party organisation sort of cracking all over the country. Despite this, this was the time when Tu Youyou and her research team sort of threw themselves into this extraordinary, groundbreaking research, which ended up finding this other sort of herbal remedy which could cure malaria, which of course has transformed medical history since, but also even more famously, perhaps the atomic programs still ongoing through the 1960s. They're thinking about international relations. It's the desire to catch up with advanced economies, both in the West and in the Soviet bloc, which underpins the closeness of the alliance between China and the Soviet Union during the 1950s, when you see this sort of almost unprecedented transfer of technology from the Soviet Union to China. And yet, of course, there's a contradiction in Mao's mind, because Mao was obviously fascinated by technology, particularly technology with a military defense application. And yet he himself, so he always very much saw himself as a peasant, sort of coming from a rural background. And so there was also this inbuilt suspicion of the educated and of intellectuals. So it is definitely a tension within Mao's own thinking and practice.
Thank you. Ralph Stein would like to know, you noted the problematic nature of current depictions of Mao and their prevalence in popular culture, like how Western tourists buy Mao merchandise and literature, and the popularity of Andy Warhol's Mao artwork. I know Drake, the hip-hop artist, has one of Andy Warhol's prints displayed in his house, and I even have friends who have posters of Mao. I was just wondering if you could expand on this phenomenon and what it reflects about Western views of Mao, and the balance between his cult of personality and celebrity, and the atrocities he played a major role in.
Very interesting question. I think it's just a profoundly contradictory cultural phenomenon, and what it expresses is a sense of cultural and political detachment within the West from Mao. I think that rationally, sort of thanks to the Yong Zhang and John Halliday biography of Mao, published in 2005, 2006, that was a big best-selling book, and I think that did change attitudes to Mao. It definitely broadened awareness of the enormities of the Mao era, sort of the famine and the Cultural Revolution, and it had a very sort of clear censure of Mao throughout that book. And yet you still have these sort of kitschy images of Mao popping up. One joke that there's a phenomenon of a joke which sort of often pops up in Christmas crackers and children's joke books in the UK, and the question goes, who's the most powerful cat in China? And the punchline is Chairman Meow. And yeah, it's just an immensely lame joke, but you would never have the equivalent joke told for Stalin or Hitler. So it really does speak of a sense of cultural distance between the West and China. And I would say this doesn't begin with Mao, it doesn't begin in the 20th century. I would say it goes back to the sort of far earlier encounters between the West and China, you know, sort of go back to the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th century and the Enlightenment, you know, all the way back into the early modern period. China was more often than not, you know, a place to be romanticized, or a place that you could sort of project what you wanted to onto it, rather than sort of undertake sort of rational, empirical, sort of linguistic investigation of what was actually there. And it swings in a pendulum. So in the sort of 16th through to 18th centuries, I'd say probably the positive appraisals, sort of romanticized appraisals of China have the upper hand. The pendulum swings back in the 19th century, where you have a sort of far more impatient demonization of China as kind of irrationally isolationist and xenophobic, you know, a portrayal which is also sort of deeply problematic from an empirical perspective. So I would say this sort of very strange set of ideas or associations around, or representations of Mao that we have today, are a continuation of a sort of much longer cultural phenomenon of Westerners looking across to distant China.
It's really interesting to situate this within this longer genealogy of Western knowledge production about China, thinking about Orientalism, chinoiserie, yellow peril, etc., etc. So we have a question by Mackenzie Bleho. So if the way that we think about Maoism could use an update, how do you view our path towards that goal? What role do historians like yourself, journalists, teachers, and other actors have to play?
Towards shaping perceptions of Mao, was that at the beginning bit?
I think that's it, yeah.
I think writers in different sectors have different sorts of roles to play. I have enormous respect for the foreign correspondents working in China, often in sort of very different circumstances, bringing out important stories. You know, earlier this year there was a sort of very unpleasant sort of tit for tat expulsion of New York Times journalists out of China, and these were people who had engaged really immersively with Chinese politics and culture. So it's just such a massive shame to not have their voices and their perspectives on China, and you know, it's incredible work done by journalists back in 2011 to 2012, when you had the most extraordinary political scandal exploding out of China that we had ever seen, in the form of the purge of the Politburo contender, Bo Xilai. Academics have, they work under different conditions. We don't have such pressing deadlines, so it's our responsibility to really dig as deep as we can into primary materials. And here I'd like to offer a massive shout out to my colleagues in the field, some of whom I mentioned near the start of my talk, but there are many others I could mention too. And these are people who, as soon as this kind of short period of archival opening became available in the early 2000s, they saw this opportunity straight away, and were in the archives getting hold of materials, and the work that they've published has transformed our understanding of so many issues which were black boxes before, like China's participation in the Vietnam War, its attitude to the sort of 1965 so-called coup in Indonesia, and so on and so forth. And it's really important here to recognize the incredible work done by mainland Chinese archival historians as well. Without the incredibly sort of detailed, tireless work done on archival materials by our colleagues in mainland China, I certainly would have great difficulty in sort of getting a handle on what is out there and how to interpret it. And these historians are sort of very bright, very resourceful, very brave, and also sort of very generous in cooperating with historians of the Cold War from different parts of the world. So I would really want to point out that historians within mainland China have been absolute pioneers of study of China within the international context of the Cold War between the 1940s and 1970s. Some actually absolutely amazing work done under very difficult circumstances.
Thank you. We have a couple of remaining questions. I know we're running out of time in the Q&A, so maybe I'll just read both of them, and then you can choose how you'd like to engage these questions. So there's one question from Christina Lean. Could you say more about the influence of great philosophers, Confucius, Lao Tzu, in Mao's thought, and if there's any continuity within his thought influence, within his ideas? And then there's also Franco Pasqualini's question. Thank you, Professor Lovell. I'm midway through your Maoism book and very much enjoying reading it. In your opinion, was Mao a true believer in Marxism, or was he more cynical and perhaps used the ideology as a tool to gain power?
Really interesting questions. Thank you very much, Christina and Franco. I think the relationship between Mao and what we might broadly label Chinese traditional thought is a very interesting one. So Mao limited the access of many Chinese people to sources of knowledge and analysis from the past, but he himself absolutely surrounded himself with these older, often ancient texts. So Mao's office was his bedroom. It was this sort of huge plank bed. He hated mattresses, so he'd sleep on this plank bed, surrounded by texts of ancient Chinese philosophy and military strategy. He was a sort of great reader also of pre-modern Chinese fiction. He loved the kind of stratagems and the cunning of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. He was also a huge fan of the 16th century novel Journey to the West, which is about this kind of omnicompetent, super talented kung fu monkey called Sun Wukong, who has all these sort of wonderful abilities and superpowers. He can travel 108,000 miles in a single cloud somersault. He can turn himself into anything he likes, and he's really fabulous at kung fu, but he is also a troublemaker. And there's this long prologue to the book in which Monkey has this extended rebellion against the power establishment within heaven and the Jade Emperor. And Mao was a huge fan of this idea of rebellion, and in fact he was reading this book, Journey to the West, on the very eve of him launching the Cultural Revolution, which began with him kind of mobilizing these young people in schools and universities to turn on party organization and ministries and, you know, all sorts of established structures of power. You know, he said, you know, we need lots of Sun Wukongs, we need these kind of kung fu monkey kings to disrupt and destroy Chinese society. So, you know, he had a very powerful emotional relationship with these sources of Chinese tradition. You know, just a few years before his death, he sort of embarked on this sort of huge fan campaign of the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, who he sort of revered for his ruthlessness, I think, his sort of ruthlessness in quashing dissent and doing whatever needed to be. So it's a really interesting contradiction between Mao, the modernizer, and someone who's suspicious of sources of loyalty from the old society on the one hand, and Mao is someone who's absolutely steeped and immersed in these sources of tradition himself. And then a kind of really interesting macro question from Franco, you know, was Mao a true believer, or was he more cynical? I'm not sure if Mao himself would have been able to answer that question. You actually see both elements within Mao. And again, I think the Cultural Revolution, his last big campaign, is the kind of locus classicus here. So this is a campaign which can be read as Mao launching it as a power struggle. It's an elite power struggle. So Mao was sort of pushed, he thought of himself as being pushed aside after the disasters of the Great Leap Forward, and his old comrades, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, had, in a limited way, brought back kind of old private sort of semi-capitalist style farming, and Mao, you know, absolutely hated that. He was very aware that Khrushchev in 1956 in the secret speech had denounced Stalin, and Mao at this point is getting on in age, and he's increasingly worried that his revolution is going to be sort of tossed out into the trash after he dies, and that people like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping are going to be China's Khrushchevs, and they're going to denounce Mao after his death and completely dismantle his revolutionary legacy. So the Cultural Revolution, on one level, it can be read as Mao undertaking a power grab in his twilight years, and there was a lot that was vindictive about the way that Mao dealt with former comrades who he felt had betrayed him. But at the same time, Mao, you know, the rhetoric of the Cultural Revolution, of course, was not about that. The rhetoric was about how the Chinese Revolution needed to be saved by these so-called bourgeois reactionaries and traitors within the party. It was about how the Chinese Revolution needs to be saved in order to liberate the Chinese people, and the Chinese Revolution needed to be saved because the Chinese Revolution was the guiding beacon to the world revolution. And you know, I think, you know, Mao was an ideologue as well. If you look back to the time when he's starting off in the Chinese Communist movement in the 1920s, if he was just out for personal power, there would be so many easier political movements to join, which would seem to hold out more hope of getting political power than the Chinese Communist movement, which spends, you know, a lot of the 1920s either sort of weak, divided, or absolutely with its back against the wall, facing an extermination campaign from their rivals by the nationalists. So, you know, ideology does matter. And then if we fast forward to his last years, I think Mao is just very conflicted. On the one hand, you have Mao orchestrating this rapprochement with the United States, with, you know, Nixon, the Red Beta, this extraordinary global political spectacle in 1972, and sort of trying to rebuild bridges with other powers in Southeast Asia, which, you know, Mao has alienated through his militant policies of funding insurgency. So Mao trying to make up with sort of Singapore and Malaysia, while at the same time Mao is still funding the Malayan Communist Party, which is, you know, fighting in Maoist style insurgencies against Singapore, the Singaporean and Malaysian governments. So, you know, all the way through, as I say, there are many Mao's and sort of many elements to his thinking and also to his practice. And I think as a historical figure, he needs to be read with that kept in mind throughout.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So it looks like we're out of time for questions, but before we say goodbye, however, as a little Cundill tradition, we'd like to send off Julia with some parting words of appreciation. So today I'm honored to deliver this brief comment on Julia's book. So we all approach books with our different reading genealogies and experiences in mind. I read Maoism as a colleague in the China field and as someone whose family was from rural China. People who are shaped by the ideals of the Mao period, including the celebration of peasants, but also experience its great tragedies and political terror. Because of academic and personal investments then, I shared Julia's interest in, quote, bringing Mao and his ideas out of the shadows and recasting Maoism as one of the major stories of the 20th and 21st centuries. I really appreciated how multi-layered and nuanced this story was. Among her many contributions in this book, Julia invites us at a time in which we must speak of a global China to consider the translation of Mao Zedong's theories and political practices into new contexts, as well as long neglected records of dialogue, collaboration, and differences between political radicals around the world. Modern China is often taken to be a recipient of Western ideas adapted to Chinese conditions. Rarely do we see China being taken as a site of knowledge production and political movements that impact the world, as we do in this book. Mao Zedong has been long known for departing from orthodox Marxism to speak to conditions in China in the early 20th century, a time when the country may have not had a sizable proletariat for class struggle, but it did have peasants that experienced their own forms of exploitation and effects of imperialism. Mao's adaptation of Marxist theory to rural revolution was one of many interventions within this intellectual tradition that have also included those made by feminist, Black, and Indigenous scholars. Together, they've allowed us to move beyond classic accounts of the wage worker in Manchester factories and attend to capitalism's other constitutive elements and settings, including agrarian societies. As I read about the different trajectories that Maoism took, I couldn't help but be reminded of Mao's early discussion of the relationship between theory and practice. Mao rejected the idea of one path to socialism, arguing that Marxism needed to be applied to new contexts and further developed if it was to serve any purpose in revolutionary struggle. In spite of his disdain for dogmatism and armchair Marxists, Mao's ideas eventually became party-state orthodoxy and lost some of their critical edge under former activists turned bureaucrats who were much more keen on modernizing the economy than permanent revolution. Julia's book shows us how the relationship between theory and practice in Maoism actually remained quite dynamic once we turn to other instances of political organizing and insurrection around the world. Just as Marxism was adapted to the Soviet Union, retheorized, and applied to China, Julia's work, perhaps more than any other existing scholarship out there, shows us the extent to which Mao's theories were in turn applied to other contexts, including Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Peru, Tanzania, India, Nepal, etc., etc. Starting with Edgar Snow's popular account of Red Star over China, Julia shows us how Maoism went global in the following decades, especially in an era of decolonization. She argues that, quote, exploring global Maoism is vital to comprehending not only Chinese history, but also radical politics in many parts of the world, the politics of disenfranchisement, discontent, and impoverishment, end quote. She brings out a new dimension in our understanding of third world internationalism by attending to the circulation of Maoist thought, Chinese foreign aid, official tours for visiting dignitaries, the training of militants, and all as part of a charm offensive that would eventually allow the country to gain a seat in the United Nations. I'm sure I speak for other readers in appreciating how you attend to the unintended consequences of the travel of Maoism around the world and the many contradictions that arose, contradictions between political idealism and opportunism, the politics of internationalism and nationalism, state building and rebellion, third worldism and Orientalism, and official feminism and personal biases. As a great example of history writing, Maoism, A Global History encourages us to go beyond the limits of our imagination in various ways. At a time of echo chambers, it encourages us to seek out dialogues that are occurring outside of our areas of comfort and expand our sites of inquiry. At a time of increasing restriction in the archives, to follow the paper trail and engage with new kinds of sources. At a time in which we're rethinking older models, to recognize how people create meaning and repurpose ideas in different ways. At a time of polarization, to acknowledge important differences even within solidarity. And in the face of the politicization of history in different ways, the need to contend with both the positive and negative parts of our past and continue to remain relevant in the present. Again, our heartfelt thanks and appreciation for your book and also your lecture, Julia. And now let's bring back Julia.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, for chairing this, but above all for so generously sharing your personal and academic perspectives on my book. Thank you. It's been a real privilege.
Thank you so much, Julia. So with that, it looks like we're out of time. So thanks again, Julia, for a fascinating talk and to our audience for joining us. So our dynamic lineup of events will continue shortly at 4:30 Eastern Time, 9:30 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. And it will continue with this year's Cundill Forum as statues fall. Our 2020 finalists, Vincent Brown, William Dalrymple, and Camilla Townsend will consider contemporary commemoration and cancel cultures and consider the role of historians in these debates. We hope that you will all tune in to that conversation too, as well as to tomorrow's much awaited announcement of the 2020 winner in a special virtual ceremony at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Greenwich time. More information and links for all of this can be found on the website, cundillprize.com. That's CUNDILL prize.com. In the meantime, thanks again, everyone. Take care and goodbye.